I never thought I'd be talking about it in this fashion, but maybe I'm just ready for this conversation here this morning. And I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Ed Thomas. Well, introduce yourself any way you want to be introduced.
Well, I'm an old man. I'm well into my 60s and grew up after World War II and caught the tail end of that renaissance in physical education forced on us by the war, and had the opportunity to train under some of those World War II masters of physical education over in Davenport. Got in on the German Turnverein, gymnastics, and somewhere in all of this, I began to study the history. I really wanted to know how we got here.
And here would be in our decrepit condition.
To this moment, yes. And I first began looking at this. I was studying at the University of Iowa after I went to serve in the infantry. And that really changed the way I think about physical training, the importance of
So
this.
were you drafted? Is that what you're saying?
I volunteered to be drafted, and I volunteered for the infantry.
But you're saying that back then drill instructors and the PT that the inductees went through was actually, in some ways, I think you assert, was better then than it is now?
That's right. At the turn of the century, from about 1885 to 1920, our European systems were well developed, the ones our immigrants brought over. The Germans, that would have been Davenport. Up in Cedar Rapids, the Swedish system with the Nissen company. And then the Waterloo had the Czechoslovakian system. And after around 1920, we threw those systems away and we went to sports. So sports dominated the way we think of physical culture. We began to disassociate the fundamentals of human movement and to focus more on the sport than the movement of the child.
And you'd blame the British on this?
The British actually had a fairly good system. I think it was just that period in time. John Dewey, the way
progressive phys ed.
Yeah, it was.
Oh my word!
Yeah,
he wrecked physical education too.
I asked one of my PE teachers back from Davenport West, "What did you see most that disappointed you?" He said, "Well, we quit teaching. We began to focus more on playing and less on teaching."
Because physical education, much like the basics in academic education, is based on skills and exercising specific muscle movements that coordinate the body and the brain. And then if you don't do it, you never develop and you stay deficient.
I'll give you an example. In the 1930s, President Hoover convened a conference on child welfare, and there was a subcommittee on body mechanics. They estimated then that around 75% of the children in 1930 had body mechanics issues, that they could not pass the minimum bar for good body mechanics.
What do you think it is now?
I think we're probably up to 90%.
Deficient?
By around second grade, you can begin to see the deformities in our children.
Well, you also, by the second grade, you begin to see the beginnings of onset juvenile diabetes, too, because we have a lot of obese grade school kids. And it usually didn't happen until high school and college in previous generations.
Yes, and obesity is one malformation. None of us are perfect, so it's really a matter of how imperfect do we get. And if we think of why children don't move, if we don't teach children to move well, they won't move. And so they don't move well, and so they quit moving.
Same way, if you don't teach them to read properly, they don't read well.
So,
I'm absolutely convinced, Dr. Thomas, that there is a direct relationship between physical acuity and mental acuity.
If you look at one individual, you can predict nothing. But if you look at 100 individuals, you can predict that the more integrated the body, then the better the brain's going to work.
I remember there was another fitness era during the Kennedy years, and I was in grade school then, and I remember the effect of that in Omaha public schools was square dancing.
Yes.
Now, which is movement, and I guess it's okay, but it was a pretty feeble endeavor to actually get it accomplished.
Well, Kennedy was from Boston, and that was where the Swedish system, and his father had evolved. Joe Kennedy was a physical culturist, his older brother. His dad went to Harvard with a very famous physical educator. Kennedy got it, but my generation moved back towards sport. A gymnasium at the turn of the century was filled with devices. No child can get fit on the ground. Children must move off the ground or gravity can't mold them. They have to hang from their limbs, lean backward, turn upside down, which has very little to do with gymnastics as we know it today. It was much more sophisticated.
This is what these jungle gyms were all about, and now we can't do it because of the legal issues.
Well, in the 60s, we began to get a lot of kids hurt because as the older generation retired, my generation wasn't as good at teaching it. The post-secondary institutions were drifting away. This all began in the 20s. We gutted the gyms. We made fun of people who were interested in fitness in the 20s. There were satirical cartoons in our magazines that basically prohibited people culturally from going to gyms. So they gutted the gym so we could play basketball and volleyball. So we began to focus on the games, and then they were kicked outside, and that's where the playground movement picked up steam. And so the teachers moved out to the playgrounds. And so that's why during World War II, we still had some people who could climb and move because they were using those facilities outside.
Wow.
When you look across the history of this, you have to look over generations, and it makes it easier to be more comfortable with the problems we face.
I need to take a short time out here. Actually, I consider this a kind of an inspirational conversation here, Dr. Thomas. This is, I think we need to return to thinking about this. And it should not, physical ed should not be looked at as either an elective or something, just a towel snapping occasion where you just... totally cavalier. It ought to be done on purpose. It ought to be objective criterias. It ought to be fun. It ought to be rigorous. And it ought to start right at the very beginning and continue all the way through the entire proposition. We're going to continue this right after a brief timeout on 1040 WHO Radio. Right now is Dr. Ed Thomas. He's an Iowa native. He's got about 25 years of teaching experience, including K-12 phys ed. A bunch of appointments, including University of Iowa, Northern Illinois University, Upper Iowa University. Fulbright Scholar, lived and worked all over the world, including Germany, Korea, Burma, and Thailand. Served in the infantry from 67 to 69. One of the top physical fitness experts in the country. You see all those infomercials on the weekends for gadgets and equipment, and I saw in one of I think it is the Jefferson County example you had in the video. They have this little thing with a ring on it and a weight on the end, and they're swinging it around. There's actually an infomercial I saw last weekend using exactly like that gadget, and they're selling this thing for like $100 for like a 6-week, like 6 videos, which is to demonstrate there's almost nothing new under the sun, but stuff that works, right?
Yes. When the Berlin Wall went down and when the Soviet Union collapsed, we began to get a lot of old stuff coming out of those areas. Kettlebells are Russian. Those same tools I used as a boy in Davenport after World War II. They were all part of those old European systems, and East Germany and the Soviet Union kept holding on to them.
Well, one of the videos you showed me was your experience as an instructor in Burma. When was that?
That was in 1988. I was approached by a group of people that said, if you apply for a Fulbright, you'll get one. And my initial thought was Fulbright. I'm a light year from a Fulbright scholar, but Burma, they wanted someone in there, and they wanted someone that had a martial arts background, a knowledge of history, and a military background, and I found out why when I got there.
Okay. How did you get your martial arts background?
I started in wrestling like all little guys that aren't going to play football here in Iowa, I suppose, and
right.
And that led to judo in the early 1960s, and when I went to Korea for a year and came back to the U of Iowa and took a judo course, and the teacher said, you should teach it, and then I was pegged from then on, and everywhere I went from then on to Northern Illinois and others, I was the martial arts guy, and I'd go find people better than I, and I would be their assistant. So I made a scam out of going for 25 years learning martial arts.
Well, way to go.
From really smart people.
But the video in Burma was if you had classes, males and females, and they had contemplative moments during their day, but then vigorous, highly organized physical activity for several hours. What was the purpose of that training for those people?
I was asked to, I was given an old PE book when I got there, and they said, don't give us the American system, it's all sports. Give us what's in this old book. It's a book I'd read many times, and it dated back to those old European systems. There are 3 content areas of PE, restorative, martial, and pedagogical. Pedagogical are sports, games, theoretical bodies of knowledge, and dance. They said, give us the restorative, give us the martial. Well, they had them in the history. They just forgot them. So they sent me 26 people, and they said, transform them physically, transform our country. So we turned them into super studs in 7 weeks, and the country loved it.
And it really, what, you fed them?
Very little, about 1,200 calories a day, house them.
And is it boot camp, basically?
500 push-ups in one day with no discomfort, one session.
I would love to have you come back again, Dr. Thomas. Is that okay?
Glad to do it, right down the road.
All right. Well, we'll do this because we barely got started in an extremely important discipline that in some ways Iowans, as well as the rest of the country, has neglected. That's physical education. I'm not talking about towel snapping volleyball. I'm talking about the real stuff. We're going to listen to the state